please welcome our dear friend Ed Russell.
Nice intro. I don't know where you got all that clip art, but pretty accurate. Well, thanks. You know, I love going to different chapters, and I've only been to a few, but each one has its own particular flavor. And this is much like going down to Naples and being at Brio, right? For the Naples chapter. It's great. But we actually meet, the Grosse Pointe chapter actually meets and Chip's been there, in the boiler room, which is in an office building that I own, and it was, hence the name, a boiler room, and we remodeled it and we put a golf simulator in, and we have a 14-foot screen with an overhead projector that beams down our program, and a large bar similar to this, and we put the coffee out, although we don't have bacon and eggs. We just have coffee and some baked goods, but I just love to be with men and see the chapters, and just each one has its own life. And Colby, we'll talk about the sexual preference thing a little bit later. I'm a little worried about you. So appreciate being here. Yeah. I was sharing. I arrived. My best friend Al picked me up yesterday, and he took me to Paul and Lisa's, and we had a wonderful meal last night. And I shared with Lisa the impression that I first got from her 12, 13 years ago down at the homestead at my first NCS retreat. And she would sit outside the auditorium with her clipboard and make notes, and just that watchful eye of making sure that everything was going on at the time. And she so impressed me, not only of her because of her beauty, but that countenance that she has. And so, Paul, you're a lucky man. So, anyway. And it's also great to be back with my brother, my best friend, Chip Scowron. So anyway, yeah. Yeah. There you go. Well, when Paul texted me, and thanks for being patient with getting me here, because it has been back and forth, and I keep saying I'm going to retire, and I just can't pull the trigger. So I appreciate you being patient. Paul asked in a text, do you have a title for your talk? And, you know, I love, and I'm going to be honest with you, I love to have speakers come to Grosse Pointe and share salacious, multiple marital affairs. They, made $1 billion and they lost it all and all that kind of stuff. It really holds the attention. That's not my story. As I said, this is the story of an ordinary man. So bear with me, but I still hope that you see Jesus and what he's done in my life. So I arrived into this world in the summer of 1959, and I am the youngest of 3 children. Grew up in a Ozzy and Harriet type home in the affluent suburb of Grosse Pointe, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And I'm just going to give you some context, because Grosse Pointe is very similar to this area. Families are rooted here deeply. My mother's family moved to Grosse Pointe in 1917, and my father in 42. And he was the oldest son of a strict German immigrant who came over to this country, and his dream was to come to America, make enough money to go back to Germany and buy a farm. Not a huge aspiration, but he saw this as an opportunity. The oldest of 8 children. He came over, World War I broke out, he couldn't go back to Europe. In the meantime, meets my grandmother, and the rest is history. He he was one of those, he had one of those rags to riches stories. He started out as a floor layer, oak flooring, different types of flooring in Detroit, and he would transport his tools and machines by streetcar, and he'd go from job to job. And he did work on homes for the Dodge brothers, of, obviously the automotive family, and many of the estates that were in Detroit at the time. But he saved his money. He had no debt. And during the Depression, he bought bank foreclosed apartments and land, duplexes, and raw land, and started assembling large tracts of property in the Grosse Pointe area, and he started building homes and apartments and so on. When my father returned from World War II, he joined the family business, and he moved back in with my grandparents and started attending their church. And one Sunday, he noticed this woman that sang in the choir with my grandmother, and he asked his mother if she would make an introduction. Well, she did, and they were married, and they were married for over 70 years. After they were married, they tried to have children immediately because of the war. My father was almost 30, and they just couldn't make that happen. So they adopted a little 18-month-old girl. 3 years later, they adopted a little boy, and I came along a year later. It was kind of interesting. At that time, I guess, when you do an adoption, you're kind of on probation for a year, and you don't go to court to have it officially sealed for 1 year. That 1 year anniversary was, my mother couldn't attend the court because she was in the hospital having me. So see the way the Lord works. I had kind of the typical Grosse Pointe upbringing: Little League baseball, the club day camps, boating on Lake St. Clair. My mother forced me to take piano lessons. But we had trips to our family hunting lodge in northern Michigan, and we spent winters in Florida. One area that wasn't typical with our family was my family's devotion to God. As a family, we would attend Grosse Pointe Baptist Church every Sunday morning and evening, and we would go to services on Wednesday. And this was something that was very important to our family. My grandfather had donated the land where the church was built and also put up matching funds to encourage others to join in, and he built the church. So this legacy or heritage was very important in our family. From an early age, I enjoyed showing my independence. One story my father used to like to share was my first day of kindergarten. I insisted on going by myself, and it just broke my mother's heart that she couldn't drop me off my first day of school. We had a very close relationship. My father passed away almost 5 years ago at the age of 95. And he used to really get a lot of enjoyment of taking me on job sites. And we had some fairly large projects, and he would drop me off. And at that time, when I was 7, 8 years old, they had returnable bottles. And now our guys, after work, they'll get a six-pack and sit in their trucks and enjoy that six-pack of beer. But back then, they used to have milk bottles. And so he'd give me a box, and I'd walk around picking up these milk bottles for 2 or 3 cents. I forget whatever the deposit was, and take them in. But the key was get out there and keep your eyes open and absorb it. And I really enjoyed the personalities that we had, electricians and painters and masons and so on and so forth. And our family was putting food on their tables. So it was a very proud heritage. My summers also included a camp experience. And my mother was very good about finding different opportunities because my older brother was starting to get in trouble. And he was a little bit of as many times you hear about adopted children adjustments and things like that, and he was having a tough time He came from a family of 6, and he was the youngest, and it was really a rough situation. And so my mother found a camp that I know some of you are probably familiar with, Deerfoot Lodge in, I think it's Specular, New York. So the idea of, at 9 years old, going in the Adirondack Mountains in a wilderness deal for 3 weeks was not that attractive to me. But I went along because my brother needed it. And the most memorable event of that trip was making a decision at that time to accept Jesus as my Savior. I was homesick, and this camp counselor led me to that prayer, and it made sense to me at the time to do the prayer of acceptance, but I thought of it as a decision or an event, not as a process. As I reached my early teen years, the 3 major themes of our family continued to be God, family, and work. But my brother was very rebellious and was always in trouble at school and with the police. And he started running away from home at an early age. And the stress in our family was high, and it really taught me to kind of toe the line with my family and not create any waves. Unfortunately, my brother, at the age of 17, fathered his first child with a 15-year-old girl, and we were separated for years from that time. And he's continued down that path of addiction and failed relationships. And he had all the opportunities that I did, but we just chose different paths. Growing up in a family business, are there any people here that have a family business? Anyway, it's a blessing and a curse because you never leave the office. Even before I joined the company, I knew everything that was going on by way of the Sunday dinner table because we were a very close family, an extended family. So we would go to church together and then have family dinners. And my grandfather was a very dominant, strict German, but he did absolutely give the credit to God for his success. He'd say it was all luck, living under Christ's kindness. You can use that one, Al. Yeah. So I loved the family business, but it was so predictable, and I was happy to do it, but I needed a little more activity. So I had 2 lives. We had our Sunday life, and I had my friends at church, and then I had my Monday to Saturday life with separate friends, different language, so on. And I really was, in fact, living 2 lives. In the fall of my junior year of high school, it happened. I met an older woman in concert choir. Her name was Marcia. She was a senior. And I found for some reason we would always sit near each other. And we got to know each other and found out that she enjoyed skiing. And so we had our first date at a local ski resort in January of 1976. Even though we came from much different backgrounds, we were intrigued with each other, and she started attending church with me because if this relationship was going to be anything more than a friendship, that was a non-negotiable deal with my family. She was to come to church. We were inseparable for years. She went to college, I went to college, and we were married in December of 1981. Marcia and I settled into our marriage. The economy started turning around. Remember, Jimmy Carter was packing his bags and going back to Plains. Reagan was coming in, interest rates were 22%. I was doing nothing, housing had stopped. And so I was anxious to get back into the workforce and do some things and carve my own path in the business world. So I said, the idea of doing homes in Grosse Pointe was fine, great money, but really didn't fill my entrepreneurial silo. So I started to invest in businesses, and I was buying fast food properties, redeveloping them. I had a limousine service that dovetailed with some of my other businesses where I could send cars out. Are there any New York Ranger fans here from way back? So Eddie Mio, remember Eddie Mio, the goalie? Well, he came after he retired, or not after he retired, after he left the Rangers, moved to Detroit. Eddie worked for me as my kind of business development guy. And if you want to attract people to come, you get a sports celebrity, right, for that. And he was best friends with Wayne Gretzky, so Gretz would always be in town. We'd go out with a fleet of limos and had a lot of fun. But anyway, that was great. So here's the problem. When most guys were home with their families on Saturdays, I would get up, put the open signs on our spec homes, go to the limo garage, go through the books, understand how many funerals, corporate runs, so on and so forth we had, and that was my life. Our social scene was getting together with old high school friends, entry-level fundraisers in Grosse Pointe, but we continued to go to church on Sundays, and we even were in a young married Sunday school class. But my main objective was success in everything I touched. In April of '84, our first of 3 daughters arrived. By all accounts, I had it all. At age 24, I had a beautiful wife and daughter, a brand new custom home on an estate that we had torn down on Lake St. Clair, lots of toys, and a seat at the family business. It felt good, but I still needed more, and I enjoyed making deals, any kind of deals. In the mid-'80s, the economy was really on fire, and so I jumped into the shopping center business. As my shopping center portfolio grew, I felt compelled to chase every opportunity that came my way to feed my need to achieve independent success outside of the family business. That success came at a price. I traded our daughter's ballet recitals for taking clients to Red Wing games. Reading and staying home in the evenings with my kids and wife for political fundraisers and planning commission meetings. There was no question that a majority of my time was being spent building my company's success and my ego. And as our dear friend BJ used to say, your ego is not your amigo. That took a huge toll on my wife and my now 2 daughters. And looking back, Marcia was willing to accept my family, my religious traditions, and had developed into this godly woman, only to have the rug pulled out from under her, and the betrayal was really starting to show in our relationship. Our arguments typically centered around my lack of being present in our marriage and in the lives of our children. I would respond by telling her that I was doing this all for you, or look at all the things we have. And I was really lying to myself. I was doing it all for my ego. I had defined myself by my possessions and accomplishments, and by the way, I wanted to be perceived by others. All Marcia really wanted was the kid that she met in high school choir that took her skiing. I had transformed the theme of God, family, and work into work with God and family as a distant second. I finally caught on that our marriage probably wouldn't survive at this pace, and I needed to make a change. Around this time, I was asked by one of my neighbors if I would be interested in attending a men's Bible study, which was made up of mostly 30-something guys from the Country Club of Detroit, and they were at a similar stage of life. That group was led by a guy in his mid-40s by the name of Mike Timmis. I knew Mike socially from our children's private school and through reading about his business successes in Crane's Detroit business. But what I didn't know about Mike was a few years earlier, he had experienced a spiritual life change. It was at this group that I really met the person of Jesus. It wasn't the religious Jesus or the Catholic Jesus or the Protestant Jesus. It was the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each week we discussed how the teachings were relevant to the group of mostly 30-somethings who thought they had the world by the tail and they could do it on their own. Slowly these teachings started to affect my approach to life. I was able to view my wife as a partner instead of a possession. I started to get serious about the example that I was with my girls, and also deliberate about being consistent in the way I treated others and not having those two lives that I referenced earlier. God didn't give me an overabundance of intellect, but I do believe he gave me the gift of relatability and to reach others where they're at, and that's certainly the way we see how Jesus worked. My environment didn't change a bit, but I saw things through a different lens. Mike would share stories of his journeys and the storms of life and how to prepare for those and how we needed to be grounded in our faith. That's the beauty of the gospel of grace. It never puts us in an unredeemable position. If we ever say, if only, God says, now you can. In the summer of '88, Marcia became pregnant with our third child, and I was in full work mode. For the past year or so, I had been developing an 80-acre parcel of property for a large shopping center and a federal highway interchange that was on it. And this project had taken on a life of its own. It was shaping up to be one of the largest of my career, and most of my family members had been bought out of the construction business, and I basically had a free hand in developing this. We hadn't even started construction, and I was already thinking about how I was going to spend my share of the deal. My biggest thought process in that was my Ferrari going to be silver or black? Can you relate to that, Chip? After New Year's, Marcia and I were looking forward to a trip to Washington for the inauguration of George Bush, and she even had a custom-made maternity dress for the event. The week before we left, I had a meeting with my father and uncle and our development team to share about the project that was happening. That same morning, Marcia was scheduled for a routine ultrasound and invited my mother to go along to the appointment. As I got back into the car, it was on the other side of Detroit with our group, got back into my car with my father and uncle, feeling like I was just the smartest developer in the world, and I was so proud of myself for putting this deal together. My cell phone rang, and it was my wife. And they had been to the doctor, and they did the ultrasound and found there was no heartbeat. So I went from the mountaintop to the valley in seconds. It was our first storm of life, but we weren't alone. Being grounded in our faith actually brought us closer together in our relationship. A year and a half later, we were blessed with our third daughter, Paige. So into the late 90s and early 2000s, we were certainly the most significant of my career. I had developed hundreds of condo units, shopping centers, custom homes, and made investments in other businesses. More importantly, I was starting to surround myself with men of faith that challenged me in all aspects of life. I had encountered worldly success, but found that it led to an empty life. I had vacation homes on Martha's Vineyard, Beaver Creek, and northern Michigan, airplanes, exotic cars, but I was miserable because I was trying to satisfy a void that could only be filled by my Creator. Pascal said, "There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator made known through Jesus Christ." My wife would be the first to point out that my growth in faith did not happen overnight, and it's a process, not an event. Just as marriage takes effort, so does spiritual growth. And not surprisingly, we found that the closer we got to God, the closer our marriage became. We also found value in joining a couples group at our church. It was very important, and some of still to this day are some of our dearest friends. I had to work hard building back the relationship with each of my daughters. During my years of self-indulgence, they more or less built their own lives without me, and restoration and trust does not happen overnight. I carried the guilt of trading quality time with my kids for material gain, but 3 years ago at my 60th birthday, we gathered in California in Malibu, where our youngest daughter lives, and I asked for their forgiveness. Beautiful. One of my biggest struggles on a daily basis is, do I want friendship with the world or friendship with God? And I think that's a decision that we have to make on a daily basis. I want to love both, but desires are like a husband that wants two wives. A one-on-one relationship is corrupted by multiple loves, and I know God insists on a one-on-one relationship. The most important factor in my personal growth has been my daily disciplines. I get up, and everybody has a different structure, but I get up in the morning very early, maybe not as early as Chip, but he texts me at 5:30, sometimes 6 a.m. I read a devotional, I read the scriptures, and it just starts my day in a meaningful way, just like going to Starbucks or whatever you might do on a habitual basis, but that's the first thing I do every morning. I still have concerns, certainly, about my children and business and the occasional health issue, but I don't carry that load alone. Another way to grow is to be accountable to someone close to you. Several years ago, the gentleman I referred to, Mike Timmis, who was a very successful businessman, chair of Prison Fellowship, both national and international, and many other organizations, was winding down his business interests in Detroit, and he asked if he could come into my office with his family office and be a part of my life. And certainly I jumped at that, and it's been a wonderful relationship. He's like my big brother. Every Tuesday morning from 9 to 10 we meet and just share our lives with each other. And then when he's in Naples during the winter, we Zoom. So we have this bond, and it's just wonderful. It's become one of the highlights of my life. I've also become very deliberate about how I approach my work relationships. Rather than doing deals that feed my ego, I look at opportunities to build friendships with clients. My platform to build these friendships is the New Canaan Society. In 2010, I was introduced to NCS by Hal Rosser, who many of you know. We were headed to Belize on a private jet out of Palm Beach to go on a vision trip through Prison Fellowship. Within 15 minutes of being on the plane and just meeting him, he shared the vision of New Canaan Society and invited me to the homestead in Virginia, where I met Paul and Lisa, to the National Retreat. And I was inspired by all the men, similar to you, from all walks of life that lived out their faith on a daily basis. When Jim Lane had the vision of starting NCS, he knew men in the marketplace needed a place to make deep and lasting relationships, and that's what you guys certainly enjoy here. But he also knew that hard work and hard play, and those two elements could provide a soil for growing relationships, and that model has served to attract men across the country, and I forget how many chapters we have, but it's significant the way it's grown. I'd like to just close by sharing a story that has a direct connection to the groundwork laid by this chapter. I had a client that was very successful in the broadcasting business, and he sold his chain of radio stations and invested in a bunch of tech things and so on and so forth. And he had all the trappings of wealth and was very social, the third trophy wife and all that kind of thing. But by his own admission, he did not have any deep relationships with other men. He didn't attend church. He was Unitarian, and his wife was Presbyterian, so they couldn't agree on that, so they didn't go anywhere. And as an aside, his daughter, who was living in Manhattan, went to Tim Keller's church, so he was always intrigued by the Jesus thing. While building his dream home, I invited him to NCS. After his first meeting, he was hooked. He had his own chair next to the counter, and we've got kind of a deal where our computers and the subwoofer and all the stuff is in the boiler room. And he would sit there and take notes and take notes and take notes. He also started coming to small group, which is a little more intimate, and we drilled down on personal situations. I was sharing with Paul, one of our small group leaders, in the context of 12 guys, asked Bob if he would pray at the end and close us out, just a simple little prayer. Absolutely not. I mean, he recoiled when asked, and that was one of his first meetings. But he always asked many questions of the speakers and could never, he was searching because he could never really make that commitment. He always was skeptical about this. In March of 2019, Chip Skowron came to the Grosse Pointe chapter to share his story. And Bob responded that he was ready to commit, but didn't know how. And I'll never forget this. Chip said, well, Bob, come here, get down on your knees. Bob got down on his knees. And if you don't think that God has a sense of humor, here is this Unitarian that didn't go to church, and an ex-con, and an Irish priest, Father Paul Donnelly, putting hands on Bob as he wept and accepted Christ as his Savior. Those two were like this, and all of the guys got around him, and we were all holding each other, and Bob was just weeping. Several months after that event, Bob was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died in July of 20. One of our brothers was moving to Denver, and in May, I called Bob and I said, Bob, I know you're going through your treatments and you're very weak. He was just trying to hold on because his daughter was going to be married in June, and he, as I said, passed in July. I said, I know you're very weak, but John's leaving for Denver. Would you come, because he's going to share what NCS has meant to him? And I had ulterior motives. I wanted to have all the guys pray with Bob because we knew he was not long for the world. And so he said, I never know how I'm going to feel when I get up, but I'll try to make it. And I pulled up at 7 a.m. in front of our building, and there was Bob sitting in his car, and I helped him down the stairs. And he said to me as I was setting up the room, I'd like to just say something at the end of the meeting. I said, well, that would be great, Bob. And at the end of the meeting, Bob stood up, and he said the most beautiful prayer that was based on summers spent with his grandparents in Missouri. He didn't have a great childhood, and his parents used to send the kids to Missouri for the summer to be with their grandparents. And he shared the most beautiful prayer of thanks for his NCS brothers and finding Jesus at that point in his life. His wife texted me the day he passed, and she said, I am so glad Bob went to Wednesday meetings with all of you. He really needed the friendship he found there, and you helped him believe in the Lord. He truly enjoyed the talk and prayers. Thank you for that, Ed. Beautiful story. Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.